Imagine this: you're trapped in the middle of a fiercely heated argument. Your heart pounds relentlessly, every word feels like a weapon, every sentence a battleground. You meticulously craft your next response, utterly determined to prove your point, to demonstrate that you are unequivocally right. But the other person? They are engaged in the exact same endeavor. Neither of you is truly listening, you're both merely waiting for the opportune moment to strike back. And then, Friedrich Nietzsche steps in. He doesn't take a side. He doesn't tell you what to say. Instead, he leans in and whispers something profoundly unsettling in your ear: you have already lost. What could he possibly mean? You're fighting, you're defending yourself, you're standing your ground. How could that signify defeat? Because, according to Nietzsche, the very moment you willingly engage in this kind of battle, a futile clash of egos, you have already surrendered your true power. Authentic strength, he argues, doesn't originate from fighting to be right, it springs from something far more unexpected and subversive. So, what exactly is this hidden power? And why does silence so often speak louder, and more profoundly, than words? Let's delve into Nietzsche's radical philosophy and uncover the silent trick that grants you undeniable power. Most people instinctively believe that power manifests through winning arguments, through proving others wrong, and through dominating conversations. Yet, Friedrich Nietzsche held a completely divergent view. He contended that power resided not in the volume or cleverness of words, but in the subtle art of control. Why do people argue in the first place? If you've ever found yourself embroiled in a heated debate, you know how swiftly things can escalate. But have you ever paused to ask why this primal urge to dispute arises? Nietzsche would assert that the vast majority of arguments are not driven by a pursuit of truth, but rather by deeper, often unconscious, psychological needs. Ego protection * people argue because their identity feels fundamentally at stake. The mere act of accepting they might be wrong feels akin to losing a vital part of themselves, a blow to their self-concept. The mind resists this perceived diminishment at all costs. Power struggles * many debates, far from being about facts or logic, are covert battles for dominance. Who gets the last word? Who dictates the tone of the interaction? Who manages to make the other person back down? These are all indicators of an underlying struggle for control. Herd mentality and social validation * some individuals argue not because they possess an unwavering conviction in their own point, but because they desperately wish to be perceived as smart, confident, or strong by their peers. They seek external validation, believing that winning an argument will elevate their social standing. Nietzsche viewed these behaviors as clear signs of weakness. He firmly believed that those who react emotionally to arguments are, in essence, being controlled by external forces, or by their own fragile ego. The moment you permit someone to provoke you, to hijack your emotional state, you have, in Nietzsche's framework, already lost the advantage. Nietzsche's famous concept of the will to power is frequently misunderstood. It isn't about brute physical force or tyrannical domination. Instead, it speaks to the intrinsic human drive to impose one's will on reality, to shape the world according to one's values and vision. This doesn't always necessitate words or overt aggression. Sometimes, the most potent power lies in the ability not to react, to maintain an unshakable inner composure. This is where the Übermensch enters Nietzsche's philosophy. The ideal, superior individual, the Übermensch, is fundamentally different from the emotionally reactive average person. He doesn't engage in arguments merely to win or to prove a point. Instead, he consciously chooses when to engage and, more importantly, when to remain silent. Because for the Übermensch, power is not found in endless talking, it resides in controlling the entire interaction. Consider an example. Imagine a crucial business meeting where two individuals are vehemently arguing. One is loud, aggressive, frantically attempting to prove their righteousness. The other, however, remains calm, collected, listening far more than they speak. They refuse to be dragged into the emotional back and forth. But when they finally choose to speak, their words are powerful, impeccably timed, and decisively shift the entire conversation's direction. Who truly holds the power here? Nietzsche would unequivocally argue that the individual who maintains inner control, who refrains from reacting emotionally, invariably wins in the long run. Why is strategic silence often more powerful than winning arguments? Silence, when deployed with purpose, is not a sign of weakness, it's a sophisticated psychological weapon. It subtly compels the other person to reveal more about themselves, their assumptions, their insecurities, their vulnerabilities. It creates a palpable sense of uncertainty, causing them to second-guess their own words and positions. It builds tension, and tension makes most people uncomfortable, thereby granting you a significant measure of control. The Übermensch doesn't merely stay silent in arguments, he wields silence as a finely tuned instrument. It's a calculated pause, a moment of strategic restraint, leading to a well-timed response that expertly flips the conversation in his favor. This is precisely why Nietzsche's conception of power isn't about fighting to win, it's about mastering the battlefield, understanding its dynamics, even before the actual engagement begins. Silence, then, is not merely the absence of words. It is a potent tool, a formidable weapon wielded by history's greatest minds to dominate battles of intellect, business, and even warfare. Nietzsche's profound idea of power was never about loud arguments or fleeting debate victories. It was about deep influence, absolute control, and meticulous strategic restraint. Let's explore three legendary figures who perfectly embodied this principle: Socrates, Steve Jobs, and Miyamoto Musashi. Socrates' method: winning without fighting. Socrates famously never engaged in traditional, combative arguments. He didn't yell, attack, or try to force his viewpoint onto others. Instead, he employed a technique so powerful that it continues to shape intellectual discussions and critical thinking today: the Socratic method. This was a systematic way of questioning that skillfully led people to expose their own logical contradictions and flawed assumptions. Imagine this: a proud Athenian politician confidently claims to be the wisest man in the city. Instead of openly challenging him, Socrates simply asks, "What is wisdom?" The politician, eager to demonstrate his intellect, begins to define it. But with every probing question Socrates asks, the politician's carefully constructed definition begins to unravel. The man, once so confident, now stumbles over his own words, slowly realizing that he has no true grasp of the very concept he boasts about possessing. Socrates never needed to explicitly tell people they were wrong. He artfully guided them to realize it for themselves. He grasped a fundamental truth: people don't genuinely accept what you tell them, they only truly embrace what they discover on their own. This is the profound essence of silent power. Instead of engaging in pointless shouting matches, ask questions that subtly lead others to question themselves. Steve Jobs' strategy: the art of controlled conflict. If Socrates dominated through his masterful questioning, Steve Jobs dominated through strategic persuasion and the art of controlled conflict. He didn't shy away from arguments, rather, he often orchestrated them. His leadership at Apple wasn't about debating every minor detail, it was about meticulously controlling the larger narrative and vision. Jobs operated on a simple yet immensely powerful principle: you don't squander energy on unnecessary skirmishes, but when something truly matters, when the vision is at stake, you go all in. A famous example was his passionate battle with his own engineering team over the iPhone's design. The engineers initially wanted physical buttons. Jobs, however, envisioned a full touchscreen device. Instead of arguing endlessly, he skillfully guided them to see and embrace his vision. He allowed them to debate, to express their concerns and skepticism, until, through his persistent guidance and unwavering conviction, they gradually realized that a revolutionary touchscreen device was not just possible, but fundamentally inevitable. He didn't tell people what to think, he made them believe it was their brilliant idea all along. Most people argue out of ego, driven by a need to prove they are right. But Jobs argued with a singular, transformative purpose: to win people over to his vision, not merely to score a rhetorical point. And that's the crucial distinction: if your words don't compel people toward meaningful action, they are, in essence, just noise. Miyamoto Musashi, the silent samurai who won before the fight began. Now, let's transcend philosophy and business and move to the brutal reality of the battlefield. Miyamoto Musashi, the legendary undefeated samurai, understood a simple, profound truth: the ultimate way to win a fight is to never even draw your sword. Musashi emerged victorious from over 60 duels, not solely through unparalleled physical skill, but predominantly through his masterful psychological warfare. His greatest victories were psychological. He deftly played mind games, unsettling and demoralizing his opponents long before the actual battle commenced. One famous instance was his duel against Sasaki Kojiro, a master swordsman renowned for his deadly speed. But Musashi didn't challenge him head-on with conventional tactics. Instead, he arrived hours late to the duel, deliberately making Kojiro furious and impatient. By the time Kojiro finally faced him, he was so blinded by anger and frustration that he made critical mistakes, allowing Musashi to defeat him with relative ease. Musashi knew that if your enemy is emotional, they are already weakened, their judgment compromised. Nietzsche's philosophy aligns perfectly with this insight: the Übermensch does not react, he controls the reactions of others. Musashi powerfully demonstrated that silence, patience, and psychological dominance are often far more potent than sheer brute force. The common thread: power through strategic silence. What do Socrates, Steve Jobs, and Miyamoto Musashi all share in common? They never squandered their precious energy on useless arguments. They did not merely react to external stimuli, instead, they dictated the terms of engagement. They profoundly understood that true power resides not in a torrent of words, but in the subtle art of influence and control. The next time you feel that powerful urge to argue, pause for a moment and ask yourself, am I reacting emotionally, or am I truly controlling this situation? Because, as these legends demonstrate, true power is often profoundly silent. Why do we argue? Why do we feel this compelling need to prove ourselves right, to fight back, to passionately defend our ideas, even when an argument is clearly going nowhere? Most people mistakenly believe that arguments are about the objective pursuit of truth. They are not. Arguments, at their core, are about power. The more you argue, the more you unwittingly reveal about yourself, your insecurities, your emotional triggers, and, perhaps most crucially, the fact that someone else is subtly controlling your reaction. Nietzsche understood this dynamic deeply. His concept of the will to power was not merely about physical dominance, it was about mastering yourself so completely that others, without even realizing it, fall under your influence. And modern psychology consistently validates just how accurate Nietzsche's insights were. Why do people get trapped in these unproductive arguments? Arguments are rarely logical, they are overwhelmingly psychological. When we argue, we often believe we are valiantly standing up for our beliefs. In reality, we are frequently just reacting to deeply rooted psychological triggers. Let's break down some of these underlying mechanisms. Cognitive biases: your brain wants to win, not learn ****. Our brains are intricately wired with a host of biases that make us remarkably terrible at arguing rationally. The biggest culprits include confirmation bias. We selectively seek out, interpret, and remember information that exclusively supports what we already believe, while ignoring contradictory evidence. Backfire effect. When someone challenges our deeply held beliefs with facts, we don't typically change our minds. Instead, we often double down on our original conviction, making us even more entrenched. Dunning-Kruger effect. The less we genuinely know about a subject, the more confident we often are in our opinions, leading to baseless assertions. These pervasive biases render most arguments utterly pointless. No one is truly listening. Instead, they are merely waiting for their turn to speak, to assert their pre-existing notions. Nietzsche's Übermensch, however, skillfully avoids this trap. He listens intently, observes carefully, and then consciously chooses whether the conversation is truly worth engaging in. Emotional triggers. Why we take arguments personally ****. Have you ever wondered why some arguments ignite a furious response in you, while others don't bother you at all? That's because we rarely argue over pure logic, we argue over identity. When someone profoundly disagrees with us on a fundamental level, it often feels like a direct, personal attack on who we are. This is precisely why debates about politics, religion, or philosophy so swiftly turn ugly and emotionally charged. People don't just feel like their ideas are being challenged, they feel like they themselves are being attacked. This critical insight explains why the most powerful individuals throughout history never argued emotionally. If someone can provoke you, can successfully trigger an emotional reaction, they effectively control you. The Übermensch does not fall for this trap. He does not react, he observes, analyzes, and then consciously decides whether or not to respond, always from a position of calm detachment. The need for validation, the real reason people argue ****. At the deepest core of most arguments isn't the pursuit of truth, it's the insistent demand of the ego. People don't just want to be right, they want to be seen as right. Nietzsche astutely understood that the majority of humans seek validation from the herd, from others. They argue not to uncover objective truth, but to gain approval, affirmation, and a sense of belonging. However, the Übermensch has no such need for external validation. He forges his own truth, his own values. Think about the most influential figures in history. Did they waste their invaluable time arguing with countless critics? Rarely. They focused with laser-like precision on their vision, ignored trivial distractions, and allowed their transformative actions to speak far louder than any words. Nietzsche was profoundly ahead of his time. His insights on power, control, and strategic silence align perfectly with modern psychological research. Let's further break down these contemporary connections. Power dynamics in social interactions ****. Social psychologists have consistently found that the most powerful individuals within any group are not necessarily the ones who talk the most. Rather, they are the ones who masterfully control the flow of conversation. They don't interrupt impulsively, they don't over-explain or justify themselves. They choose their words with meticulous care, making others lean in, hanging on to every sentence. This is why truly powerful leaders rarely need to raise their voices. They don't need to shout to be heard. When they speak, people listen attentively because they have already cultivated an undeniable aura of authority through their deliberate pauses and measured silence. The role of self-restraint and persuasion ****. Research in behavioral psychology unequivocally demonstrates that individuals who remain calm and composed during arguments are vastly more persuasive than those who succumb to emotional outbursts. Why? Because humans are instinctively wired to perceive calmness as a powerful indicator of confidence, competence, and underlying strength. Nietzsche believed that true power emanates from self-mastery. The Übermensch is not a slave to his volatile emotions, he does not react impulsively. He decides, and that conscious control makes him virtually untouchable. The real reason Nietzsche saw silence as a profound form of power was not because he advocated for avoiding conflict altogether. It was because he knew, with chilling clarity, that the one who controls his own reactions ultimately controls the entire conversation, the entire interaction. Let's put this into stark perspective. If someone insults you and you react emotionally, you have lost. If someone challenges your views and you feel an overwhelming urge to frantically defend yourself, you have lost. If you allow yourself to be pulled into an argument purely to prove you are right, to satiate your ego, you have lost. But if you observe calmly, maintain your composure, and choose to respond only when it strategically serves your purpose, you have, in Nietzsche's view, already won the decisive battle. Nietzsche's philosophy is not about remaining silent forever, it is about the profound wisdom of choosing your battles. Ask yourself these critical questions: am I speaking because I genuinely want to, or because I feel compelled, forced, to respond? Am I reacting emotionally, or am I in complete control of my response? Is this argument genuinely worth my precious energy, or am I merely feeding my ego? Because true power, as Nietzsche envisioned it, lies not merely in words, but in the silence before the words. It's in the calculated pause that makes others lean in expectantly. It's in the conscious decision to speak only when it profoundly matters. And that, ultimately, is the silent trick that grants you undeniable power. Beyond silence, the power of strategic engagement. Silence is undeniably powerful, but does that imply you should always remain silent? Silence can indeed be a potent weapon, but wielding it indiscriminately can be as foolish as speaking without careful thought. If silence were the sole path to power, then history's greatest minds, philosophers, revolutionaries, and visionaries, would have remained unheard, their voices muted. Yet, they spoke, because real power lies not in avoiding conflict entirely, but in possessing the profound wisdom to know precisely when to engage and when to hold back. Nietzsche's will to power, conflict as a path to mastery. Many mistakenly interpret Nietzsche as an advocate of withdrawal, of a detached passivity from life's struggles. But his concept of the will to power was never about quietism or inaction. It was about relentless domination, of self, continuous growth, and radical self-overcoming. Power is not found in silence alone, it is found in absolute control, control over oneself, and thereby, over the interaction. Avoiding conflict completely is not wisdom, it's often fear disguised as cautious restraint. Mastering conflict does not mean rejecting it, it means consciously using it as a deliberate tool for growth and transformation. Nietzsche's Übermensch does not argue over petty, insignificant matters, but he also does not run from necessary, consequential battles. He understands that conflict, when approached with mastery, can be a crucible for forging immense strength. Why do most people instinctively avoid arguments? Because they are uncomfortable. But Nietzsche profoundly understood that discomfort is often the very breeding ground for strength. He viewed struggle as an essential, necessary process, not something to be evaded. Weak thinkers actively avoid challenges, strong thinkers actively welcome them, precisely because challenge forces refinement, clarifies thought, and builds resilience. Imagine a warrior who never enters battle, a blade that is never tested against steel. Such a blade will never be truly battle-ready. In the same way, a mind that is never challenged remains dull, weak, and ultimately fragile. Without intellectual conflict, your ideas remain untested, unsharpened. Without struggle, your convictions remain hollow, untested by the fires of opposition. Consider the boldest thinkers in history. Galileo was condemned for challenging the Church's geocentric view of the universe. Socrates was sentenced to death for courageously questioning conventional beliefs. Nietzsche himself was often dismissed as a madman in his own time, yet today, his groundbreaking ideas continue to shape modern thought. Their power did not stem from silence alone, it came from choosing their battles with immense wisdom and strategically engaging in necessary conflict. There exists a critical distinction between arguing merely to prove you are right and arguing to fundamentally shape reality. Nietzsche grasped this distinction perfectly. The greatest leaders, philosophers, and visionaries don't avoid arguments, they utilize them strategically, as levers for change. Consider how Socrates did not directly attack others' beliefs. He meticulously questioned them until their flawed foundations collapsed under their own weight. Nietzsche's own writings were deliberately designed to challenge, provoke, and shake people out of their mental complacency. Steve Jobs didn't avoid conflict, he expertly used it to push his teams beyond their perceived limits and to drive unprecedented innovation. Powerful individuals do not argue for external validation, they argue for transformation. They do not fight to win trivial debates, they fight to shape the world according to their audacious vision. The Übermensch does not argue to satisfy his ego, he argues with profound purpose. Here's when you should engage in conflict. When the argument sharpens your thinking and refines your ideas. When it reveals deeper, underlying truths that might otherwise remain hidden. When it pushes you or others to grow, to evolve, to transcend current limitations. When it strategically shifts power, influence, or understanding in your favor. But here's when you should not engage, when you are merely defending your ego, rather than pursuing a greater purpose. When the other person is clearly not open to change, reason, or genuine dialogue. When it devolves into a pointless, emotional battle that drains your energy. When your silence itself is a more powerful and strategic move. Arguing without strategy is weakness, arguing with precision, purpose, and control is true power. Nietzsche was not afraid of arguments, he embraced conflict, but always on his own terms. If an argument makes you weaker, avoid it. If an argument makes you stronger, engage with it, masterfully. If an argument is merely a distraction, ignore it completely. If conflict makes you stronger, it is not something to be avoided, it is something to be mastered. True power lies not in silence alone, but in the profound wisdom of knowing precisely when to speak and when to remain strategically silent. If you had the choice between never arguing again or mastering the art of influence through precisely chosen conflict, which would ultimately make you more powerful? Imagine this, you wake up one day, and a voice tells you, you only have 100 words left to speak in your entire life. Every sentence, every single word, now carries immense weight. Would you squander them in a heated, emotional argument? Would you spend them frantically trying to prove yourself to someone who isn't even listening? Or would you choose them with exquisite care, like a warrior sharpening his final, decisive blade before an ultimate battle? This is where true power resides. Nietzsche understood something that most people ignore: words are currency. The more carelessly you spend them, the less valuable they inevitably become. Now, picture yourself in an argument. Your heart races, your mind floods with a torrent of comebacks, defenses, and points you're desperate to prove. But stop. Breathe. Ask yourself, who truly holds the power here? The one frantically trying to prove himself, or the one who possesses the wisdom to stay silent? Because silence is not weakness, it is profound strategy. It is control. It is the subtle art of making others question themselves, without you ever needing to utter a single word to convince them. So, here's the challenge: the next time you're about to argue, pause. Instead of reacting immediately, observe. Watch how the other person inadvertently reveals their weaknesses. See how they betray their fears, their insecurities, just by the way they speak, by the tenor of their voice. And then, when the time is precisely right, choose your words like a master, or don't speak at all. Because true power is silent. Want more insights on philosophy, psychology, and power? Hit subscribe and turn on the bell icon so you never miss a deep dive into the ideas that shape the way we think and live. Stay sharp. Stay powerful.